words: invest in yourself. I have been chasing this investment and that investment and rental properties. I could have invested in a piano teacher and probably had a better return. But those words, as I grew older, they really stuck with me, and I've made it a point to invest in myself. I invest a certain percentage of everything that comes in the door in upgrading equipment or taking an online course, and I don't stop learning. And I think that's great advice. Invest in yourself.
That was Edgar Struble. Edgar is a multifaceted creative. He's a film producer, music director, author, performer, and public speaker. He played critical roles in superstar Kenny Rogers' band for 15 years. He has an ongoing association with Dick Clark Productions, where he's been the music director and composer for the Academy of Country Music Awards and the Billboard Music Awards. To say he's been in and seen so many interesting situations and rubbed shoulders with all sorts of stars would be an understatement. Today, he's working to mentor younger folks in the industry and continues to expand its roots into film production. Let's learn how this dynamo balances life, entertainment, and his health to help the beat go on.
I'm Sally Hussey, the CEO of 50 Forward, and we elected to launch this podcast because we know older adults have such inspiring stories and wisdom worth sharing. We have now all learned that social connections are critical to our well-being. This podcast is made possible by 50 Forward, the leading resource for adults 50 plus in Middle Tennessee who seek to live longer, more fulfilling lives.
You're listening to Squeeze the Day, where we talk to extraordinary people over the age of 50 who are living their best life now. Their stories of a well-lived life are both inspiring and encouraging to all of us as we seek to navigate a meaningful and purpose-driven second chapter in our life. Today's Squeeze the Day is brought to you by the All of Us Research Program from the National Institutes of Health. Learn how you can help change the future of health by participating in the program. Visit www.joinallofus.org to learn more. I'm Susan Sizemore, Communications Director for 50 Forward, so let's get started. Welcome, Edgar.
Hi, Susan.
So nice to have you here.
You're my neighbor.
We are neighbors, but right now, well, we feel like neighbors too, right across the 600 miles in technology.
Exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about first impressions. I first met you when you came to our high school choir to sub for our teacher, Ray Dempsey. You likely don't remember this as much, but I do. It was a big deal. You had hit the big time. Let me paint a picture for our listeners. This was maybe around 1975, just before Edgar joined the Kenny Rogers Band. Admittedly, we both have extremely unruly hair, or he did at the time, or maybe we both did. So I can share this because it's our life. Just imagine, in walks a substitute just a few years older than all of us. He has a huge afro and massive bell bottoms. You have such a presence. I wish I could remember what we actually worked on that day, but I do know your reputation preceded you. It was so much fun for high school students to see someone from our very small community follow their dreams to become so successful in so many ways.
Oh, thanks. You know, I look at those pictures with that hair, which was wider than my shoulders at one point in time, and those bell bottoms, and I think, what was I thinking? And then I think, oh, I wasn't thinking.
You were following the music business, which was great. Yeah. So let's talk a bit about your roots.
Sure. Well, first of all, my mother was a concert violinist, transplanted from Boston to Scottsville, Michigan, and she was a self-taught barrel house piano player, too. And so I grew up with an upright piano. It's right over there, by the way, next to my bed from the time I was about 5 years old to, I still have it. It's over there. It's not next to my bed anymore, but it was in my bedroom when I was a kid. And so she kind of taught me a little bit here and there, as much as I was willing to learn. I took some piano lessons. I played midget league baseball when the piano teacher wanted me to be a child prodigy, and I got back to music in junior high and playing by ear, and played my way through high school and sock hops and all that stuff. Little group we called combos at the time. The Apricot Shoebox, the Nebulons, and then Band X, and then Joy Spring, and then Chopper, and then on to Nashville and thereabouts. Grew up listening to James Brown, by the way, not country music. The big flamethrower from Nashville would come in after about 9 o'clock at night. I can't remember the call letters right now. But
WLAC?
WLAC. You're absolutely right. Yeah. And they had rhythm and blues and soul music on after about 9 o'clock at night, and I used to devour it. And that sort of turned the light on.
So how did you end up with Kenny Rogers?
Well, that's an interesting story. I worked with this rhythm and blues band. When I graduated from college with a degree in music education, so I was a qualified band director and qualified to substitute teach, and I substituted one flu season. And that's when you... And after that, I thought, if I'm going to do anything with my career, I need to go where the music's being made on a national level. So I'd been in New York, wasn't excited about that, didn't have the guts or the wherewithal to go to L.A., so I went to Nashville because I knew somebody there I could stay with. And sure enough, he let me stay at his house for a month and introduced me to people. And there was this group of guys playing at this Holiday Inn, a drummer and 2 keyboard players. And one of them played bass with his left hand. And they were doing OJs and spinners and rhythm and blues. And I thought, oh, this is kind of cool in Nashville. And I got to know him, and I ended up setting in with him. Then I went back to Michigan for a month. And during that time, Kenny Rogers had just split up with the First Edition, and he was starting to record albums on his own as Kenny Rogers. And he wanted to hire a Nashville-based band to go out on the road because he was leaning towards country music. So he hired these 3 guys, plus a guitar player from another band. And when I came back to town in March, they were rehearsing with him during the day and playing this Holiday Inn gig at night. And so I sat in with them for another month or so, and they introduced me to everyone that came through the door, including Kenny Rogers, and I got to meet him a couple times. And they went on the road with him. I went to a Ramada Inn and played there for 5 months. When that gig was coming to an end, by the grace of God, Bobby Daniels called me, the drummer for Kenny, and said, Kenny wants to add a 3rd keyboard player. Can you play clavinet and synthesizer? And I said, yes. And I'd never seen a clavinet or a synthesizer. But I figured, what the heck, they have keys, right? So that was kind of my job interview. And in September of 76, I went on the road with Kenny Rogers, and for the next 15 years, we traveled all over the place. And he was barely anything in 1976. Of course, I rode that wave to stardom with him in the 80s. It was just phenomenal.
Mm-hmm. What were some of the big hits during those times? Thinking Lady?
Well, the biggest, Lady came later, but the first big hit was Lucille.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a great story there. I was invited to the studio when they were cutting that song, and it was just a regular old session. And they said, well, what's up next? And Larry Butler, the producer, played this demo of Lucille. Let's do this song. I think it's going to be a good one. And I heard that song, and I thought, this is the most hillbilly, country bumpkin, awful thing. How could you? This is a guy that I just dropped in to see what condition my condition was in. He was kind of a pop star, Kenny Rogers. And but he wanted to record country music, and boy, this was a country tune. But they recorded it, and I was there when they recorded it. I didn't play. I was just an observer at that time. But then it got released to radio, and it was a huge hit. And I still wasn't crazy about it, but as it got more and more airplay, Kenny's fees went up, and my salary doubled. And I thought, oh, this isn't such a bad song after all.
Wow.
And so it went. We recorded that, and he recorded The Gambler while I was around, and Daytime Friends, and She Believes in Me. That's the first record I ever played on, first hit record I ever played on. And all sorts of stuff, including Lady.
That's amazing. What a time to be with an entertainer of his caliber.
No. Oh, and I learned so much sitting around that campfire.
And your salary doubled. Everything was perfect. So you've also worked with lots of other music stars, and we could talk about this for a week, but I think it might be fun to just share a little bit about some of the other folks you've worked with.
Well, sure. I had the privilege of being music director for Dottie West for just a season when she was out with Kenny Rogers. I did a month with her at the Frontier in Las Vegas, and that was so much fun. And I've worked with Dolly as a music director and as a band member when she came out and toured with us. We were her band for a while. I worked with Bobby Hatfield of the Righteous Brothers, actually produced 4 songs on him. And Al Hurt, the trumpet player from the 60s, remember him? He had hits called Java and Cotton Candy were his big radio hits. But he was kind of a jazz trumpet player. And I've worked with the Oak Ridge Boys. I was music director on their Live from Las Vegas series back in 98 or 99. You kind of remember that? It was a TNN series. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then I worked with Leroy Purnell as the band member for a short time right after I left Kenny Rogers Group in 1991. He's a friend, and I went out to kind of help him out and had a lot of fun with him. And of course, as music director for the Academy Country Music Awards, I've worked with just about everybody. I've been on that show for 20 years, and they all come through there at some point in time, Miranda and Taylor Swift. And I remember when she was just 15. And singing with Tim McGraw, and oh my goodness, yeah. So all the country stars, not lately because we've had COVID for the past 2 or 3 years, and I haven't had a chance to actually be hands-on music director on that show because it's all been remote.
You touched a bit on TNN. So TNN was the Nashville network. It was very early on the cable TV scene. And you actually worked on the Primetime Country series for the Nashville network. And I remember at that point, it was produced by Rack Clark, Dick Clark's son. And we worked on some things together then. And those were good and story-filled times. But I wondered if you had any nuggets from the Primetime Country days.
Well, not so much nuggets as it was a great time to build relationships. Rack and I are best friends. And we have been since that show, basically. And that relationship not only has been a very fruitful personal relationship, but it's been a great business relationship for me. Because in 95 and 96, he was producing Primetime Country and did so for the next few years. Although my contract expired and I was replaced by the new host's music director. But I maintained good terms with Rack. And when I moved to Los Angeles in 1999, he put me on some Dick Clark shows. As a result of that relationship, I've had access to Dick Clark Productions, and I did several primetime shows for them, including a series called Greed. It was a game show, but it was a very good show, and for me, it was kind of a little cash cow. It was really, really a nice little lick. And then later on, I was put on as music director of the American Music Awards and the Academy Country Music Awards and the Billboard Music Awards, all because of that initial relationship with Rack. And also, I've carried some of my relationships with some of the other people on that show to this day.
Yeah, and those relationships, you've demonstrated how they've paid back numerous times in your life. One of the ongoing gigs, as they call them, you touched on, and that's the Academy of Country Music Awards and the Billboard Awards. And just for listeners, tell us a bit about preparing for those shows. That's got to be massive.
Yeah, it's quite a long process because the Academy of Country Music Awards for many years insisted on having fresh music for every show. And by music, of course, not the artists that perform, but what we call bumper music. Going out to commercials, that's called a bumper. And it's usually about a minute and a half piece of music. And, the music will start and then they'll start saying, don't go away, we'll be right back with, Kenny Rogers and the Oak Ridge Boys and da-da-da-da-da. And then they come back from commercial, that's called a rejoin, and I write those, and then there's play-ons and play-offs. And so there's about 20 to 30 pieces of music every year that have to be written. They're like miniature songs that it's a specific kind of a bandwidth where you don't want to do too much because you don't want to detract from the spoken word, from the announcements. But you want it to be exciting enough that people are not going to turn the channel off, too. It's an interesting little niche market that I found that I could do pretty well. So the majority of my work for all those shows is composing music for the bumpers and rejoins and a theme song. And then I do hands-on music directing, particularly for the ACMs, the Academy of Country Music Awards. There's always somebody that wants to do a medley or a duet, and I'm the guy that directs those rehearsals and say, Miranda, you sing the first verse, and whoever, you sing the second verse, and let's cut this guitar solo in half because this is television and we want to see the stars, not the guitar player. And I love that. It's what I was born to do.
And that's a sort of behind-the-scenes production that most people wouldn't even think about, but now they might look at it maybe with a more critical eye and critical ear as well. I remember standout stories or near misses in television production that happen with great frequency. Of course, if it's live, it just kind of happens, and you go on and try to make the most of it. And then if they were taped, of course, you could do a second take. But do you have any standout stories or near misses that you'd want to share?
Oh, goodness. I've got a little story I remember about Primetime Country. Primetime Country was just a joy for me to do. I was 100% in my element. And when Bob Eubanks hosted that show, he allowed me to participate. And I even stood out front and did some commercials as a, kind of like a Doc Severinsen. And he allowed me to do that. It was so much fun. And I remember when I was standing out front and there were a couple of dogs. One of the artists brought dogs to the studio, of all things. And I'm trying to do this Clorox commercial or something. And these dogs are just going off behind me. And I said, oh, golly, or something like that. I reacted. And that ended up on bloopers on Dick Clark Productions.
Right. Yeah, I can think of a number of bloopers along that line, but we don't have too much time, but I knew that something would come to mind because they happen all the time, and sometimes the viewers get to see them, sometimes they don't. And the most beautiful thing is when the genuine host can maintain and pull the audience and at home and in the studio through that situation with some sort of finesse, which takes talent.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about your personal life. Our personal life is always a part of all of our journeys. And like everyone, there have been challenges in yours and not something you shy away from. So tell us a little bit about alcohol.
Well, somebody said, I don't know if he's got a drinking problem, but he's sure going through a lot of ice. I had about 15 years where I drank too much. And I finally ran out of myself and had to join the social club. And it's been about 33, 34 years now that I've been sober. But that was the best thing that ever happened to me in my life. My whole life opened up with sobriety. And I certainly don't mind talking about it. I wasn't the kind of a drunk where I was falling out of bed every morning and reaching for a bottle. But every night after the show, I managed to put something down the hatch. And usually it was too much. So when I reached out for help, I was with a group of people that were already sober. And I just happened to be at the fellow's house, a drummer friend of mine, deceased now. And I said, Mike, I need help. And he said, oh, we've been waiting for you.
Oh.
Yeah. So, and from that time forward, I never had the desire to drink. I was just delivered from that by the grace of God. But what was between my ears, the committee meeting every 5 minutes, was what was causing me to drink. It was medicating losses and family of origin issues and things like that. And my mother was a saint. My father, unfortunately, was an alcoholic, so I had that dynamic in my family. And my dad was a wonderful, loving father, but he had that little monkey on his back, and it was tough. So I grew up with that propensity, and even though I told myself I'll never be like that, I ended up being just like that. And, at some point in my life, I got sober, and I stayed sober. So far, don't think I'll go back. I have a never again list. There are only a couple things on it, and that's one of them.
Well, I think it's so important not only to talk about that, and you and I have touched on it. It's amazing to me how many people I've met who, especially in the music business, who have been eager to say, I don't drink any longer, or I'm an alcoholic, or whatever it is. But I think until other people hear real world stories. It gives everyone an opportunity to do a little self-evaluation and maybe it
Sure.
will help them through their journey. So thank you.
Yeah, and I hope so, because it's nothing to be ashamed of, but it is something to address.
Yeah.
It will absolutely change your life if you can get to sober thinking and some modicum of serenity.
Mm. So today you're focused on eating well and mental and physical fitness too. Tell us a little bit about your routine.
The 4 P's: push-ups, pray, piano, and planks. And I walk. And that's just about all I do. But I try and do it every day. I'm not at the top of my game with the push-ups, but about a year ago I was doing 100 push-ups a day, but only 20 at a time. But you don't have to do that 5 times a day, and you got 100 push-ups. Planks, that's great for your little gut and all that stuff. And I don't like to run. I hate to exercise, come to think of it. But, it's I'm 70, almost 71.
Mm.
And I looked down one day and couldn't see my belt buckle. I thought, uh-oh, we've got to do something about that. I'm a skinny little guy, but... So,
well, in country music, you can have the biggest belt buckle that you want. It's as big as your head. Yeah.
So now I can, and that's helped. To just doing those, maintaining that physical routine and the spiritual routine too. That helps too with life. But that's been a part of my life since I've been 5 years old.
Mm.
Well, I spent a lot of years ducking God too when I was drinking. I didn't want him to see any of that stuff.
Mm-hmm. So behind every good man, they say there's a good woman or partner of support. And now I'm going to let you brag a little bit about your wife, because she's undertaken some real serious things and she's getting lots of visibility for it.
Yeah, she's an amazing gal. Just got her certification as a personal trainer and then has gone on to do some other things. She's also a grief counselor too, which is an interesting. And she's involved in the recovery community as well. She's a year more sober than I am, actually, and she's the reason that I got sober initially. I mean, once I figured it out, I got sober for me. But when I first got started, I thought, I better get sober so I can have something in common with this gal. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I don't want to go into all that, but the point is she's an amazing gal. She's over 50. Let's leave it at that. And she's a superwoman. She can do all sorts of weightlifting and things like that. And she's a runner. She's done marathons. She's not doing marathons anymore, but 5Ks, things like that. And she's also encouraging. She works at a fitness place where it's more than just here's the key and there's the rowing machine. It's a real hands-on personal training gym in California. And she just loves it. And she's actually ministering to older people who need a little bit of hope, and they look at her and they say, well, gee, I can do that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, that's good. And I do think more people should be focusing on older people, because many people I know will say, well, I just can't. It's just, and I'm like, if you don't start, you won't be able to do any of this.
Yeah, you got to start. And, I started with 10 push-ups. That's all I could do. Now, and you just do them. It only takes a minute to do, and body weight exercises, you don't have to go to the gym. You can do push-ups and pull-ups and planks and do your walking. And I think now I'm not a fitness expert. Lori probably have a different opinion about this, but it served me well.
So I want to talk a little bit about Lori and the gift that the two of you have together, which is 4 darling daughters, and you are so outnumbered by all those women. But is there anything you've learned or you'd like to share?
Well, yeah. At one time I have my wife, my 4 daughters, a granddaughter, a girl dog, a girl cat living in my house. And I just wake up in the morning and apologize. Work just fine.
That's perfect.
But no, in all seriousness, I wish there's a lot of, I don't have regrets, but I have more like wishes. I wish I had spent more time with them, less time trying to work, trying to be out there all the time. I don't want to miss this job and just doing that and traveling here and traveling that. The girls, especially, I've seen that at right around 13 or 14, the aliens take them away. And that's a real disconcerting time. And some of them, it takes a little longer for them to come back. Most of my kids are on the way back. All of my kids are on the way back now, but pretty much all of my kids, except maybe for the youngest one, got sucked up by the aliens around 13 or 14. And that's a tough time for parents. And I wish we had been able to rewrite that script in a little more positive manner. And I think by spending more time with them and being a little more attentive to what their hearts were, could have facilitated that as a father.
When did they come back from being an alien?
Oh, late 20s.
I was going to say somewhere in the 20s.
Yeah, somewhere in the 20s, yeah. I have a granddaughter. She's 13 now. And the aliens are hovering, but they haven't sucked her up in the spacecraft yet. We just got back from a road trip. We went up to Pennsylvania and picked up an antique car and drove it back on the back roads. And we had such a wonderful time. And I tell you, if you get a chance to do something like that with your grandkids, those are memories.
Yeah, that's
worthwhile.
So you're talking right in this area right now about leaving a legacy through your children or your grandchild. And I know you're working some with some younger artists and also on a movie. So just share a bit about what's on the horizon right now for you.
Sure. Well, the biggest thing is I'm always available for young artists who have questions. And I love giving advice. And I guess at this age, I have some semblance of wisdom, so I like to share that as much as I can. But the project that I'm most excited about right now is a project we're going to be making a 6-part limited series out of a book by author Andy Andrews. And I know you know Andrew. Back in the 80s, he was a stand-up comedian and opened for Kenny Rogers. And I got to know him during that time. And I never really, although we drifted apart for many years, he never really gone too far from my sights. And I reconnected with him about 10 years ago, and we talked about a couple things, and one of which was this story. And he sent me a whole pile of his books, and I read this story, and I thought, boy, that'd make a great movie. I've produced 5 or 6 independent films in the last 10 years or so. And I thought, I'd like to make a movie out of it. He said, well, somebody's optioned it. And that happened a couple times. And finally, last time I called him about 2 years ago, he said, I'm just getting ready to sign another option, but you let me know what you think about this. And so we got to talk, and he said, I kind of like to work with you. So I connected with a couple of friends of mine, one from Grand Rapids here and one from Sacramento. They have a company that puts together scripts and hires writers and things like that. And so we formed a great working relationship, actually. And now we're working with Andy to develop this book into a series for a new streaming service, which I can't talk too much about the streaming service, but the development process has been a joy, and Andy Andrews has been a joy. He, by the way, is no longer a comedian. He's a New York Times best-selling author times 2, and kind of a Will Rogers of the 21st century, a real sage. And it's important to me to keep going. I still have a lot of energy. What I'm not doing is stuff that's not rewarding. And I don't think that I have to do anything right now. And I'm comfortable in my retirement years, but there's things that I want to do, and boy, I'm going after them with guns blazing. I have an acquaintance who's actually a rock star, Maynard James Keenan from the band Tool. He's a Mason County guy, but they're huge. Anyway, he says, you cut to Decline of Western Civilization Part 2, where you see this guy from a rock and roll band drunk in his pool, and you go, that's where you end up? And the answer is, in a music career, that's where you end up, drunk in your pool, especially if you hang your hat on the thing you did, not the thing you're doing. And isn't that great?
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily hang my hat on the stuff that I did, but I'm doing some stuff, and it's a lot of fun.
It's so motivating to hear you talk about all the things you're doing in your 70s, and your chapters, you've still got lots that you're interested in doing. So one of the things that we ask everyone in the podcast is, we ask about a piece of advice that your parents or an older adult might have shared with you that at the time you thought was silly, but now that phrase rings true in your everyday life. Does something come to mind for you that?
Yes, absolutely. And I don't know that I think that the thought that my mother's advice was silly, but I was so intent on doing other things that I didn't really take much heed to it. But she said 3 words: invest in yourself. I had been chasing this investment and that investment and rental properties. And I bought a house in Scottville, Michigan for $4,000 once.
Wow.
I know. And I worked on it for weeks and sold it for not a whole lot more than that. I could have invested in, I don't know, a piano teacher and probably had a better return. And I could have invested maybe in some recording gear and had a better return. But I was off doing this and doing that. There's a lot of things that have distraction. I have a lot of distractions in my life. I think this is part being ADD and, just kind of having all this energy and looking over here and the grass is always greener things. But those words, as I grew older, they really stuck with me, and I've made it a point to invest in myself. I invest a certain percentage of everything that comes in the door in upgrading equipment or taking an online course, and I don't stop learning. I think that's great advice. Invest in yourself.
Yeah, I totally agree. So I just have one more question, and that is, what is it, Edgar, that you do to squeeze the day?
And that's a great question. I make a list. That helps me so much. I make a list. I don't put too much stuff on it, and I don't beat myself up if I don't get everything done. But there's some bullet points at the top that are kind of big ticket items that I want to take care of during the day. I make a list every Sunday when I'm quiet. That's kind of my day of rest. I try and make the list for the week, just a few items each day that I think I want to knock out. And then as, of course, the week progresses, the pages fill up a little more. But I've learned that 14 or 15 items on a page is a self-defeating list. So it's more like 7 or 8. And then there's always something that comes up to fill in the 9, 10, 11, But that's how I squeeze a day. Because if I don't write that list, I'm on YouTube looking at road rage videos or something, I can just go down that rabbit hole just like that.
Well, there are a lot more rabbit holes to go down these days than there used to be. And that, to me, is also, I think, the tough piece of advice. There's just too many distractions, too many channels, too much on the internet, too much. And somewhere you have to have some barricades or roadblocks or discipline to have focus. I love that.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us today. What an amazing life of leadership we're witnessing from interviews and stories such as yours. Now we challenge everyone listening to go squeeze the day.